Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Margaret, and welcome to the first episode of the Teenaged Thoughts podcast. And today we're going to talk about the similarities of Euphoria and of Mice and Men. So, I learned about Of Mice and Men in my English class at school, and about the same time when Euphoria season 3 came out. So, that was when I realized that there are a lot of similarities between Euphoria and Of Mice and Men, and I'm going to discuss about their similarities from my perspective as an English student. And just a disclaimer, those are my personal thoughts and are for entertainment purposes only. So let's dive in. So first of all, I would dignify Curly's wife in Of Mice and Men by giving her a name because she is referred to as Curly's wife throughout the entire book, and that is for the reason of showing how her husband, Curly, who is the son of the boss of the ranch that the men on the ranch work at, and Curly is portrayed as this really violent and egoistic character. And so Steinbeck, the author of the book, probably chose this way of referring to Curly's wife to show how Curly dominates his and his wife's relationship. And so we're going to give Curly's wife a name, and I chose Laura. So the first thing that ties into this name is Nate's engagement ring and flowers for Nate's and Cassie's wedding in Euphoria, and Curly's hand in Of Mice and Men. So, in Of Mice and Men, Curly, he is a very violent character, and one scene he was with other men on the ranch in a room talking about something, I believe, and a character called Lenny, he was laughing about something, and Curly saw him. So Lenny is a character who is incredibly big and strong but has a mind of a 5-year-old. So a lot of his thoughts are very childish, but his actions are also very violent because he can't really control his strength. And so when Lenny was laughing about something just very quietly, not at Curly, Curly saw it as Lenny was kind of challenging his power on the ranch. And so Curly decided to fight against Lenny. And Lenny is, of course, very strong. He's very tall. And so Lenny crushed Curly's hand right away in the fight, and Curly was left in pain. And so that is an indication of Curly's preference for violence, and also his desire to assert his dominance on the ranch and to show that he controls everything. And because even if he won, he would that would show that he is very strong. But even if he lost, it would seem like the guy who has more physical dominance in the fight, was being unfair because he's bigger. And so for Curly, it's a win-win. But that just shows that he likes to use his violence and different ways to assert his power and to reassure that people know of him on the ranch. And so that ties into Nate's choice of spending, I think, $500,000 or $50,000 on his wedding with Cassie, on the floral decorations and the engagement ring, over paying debt. And so the debt here represents his own personality and his own being, while the engagement ring and the flowers represent his possession of Cassie. And so I think this shows that Nate also chooses to prioritize other people's perceptions of him over actually establishing his own life personally. And this desire of control, I think, is what is really similar of those two men. And we'll get to that a little later too. So, our second point here is Cassie and Laura's Hollywood dream. And so, in Of Mice and Men, Laura's Hollywood dream is referenced in two places. So, once she was in the barn with other characters that represent the marginalized communities in the United States. And so she represents women in that group. And she was talking about her Hollywood dream of achieving autonomy and having the chance of being a star and getting fame and getting wealth by being in Hollywood. And she craves this just like how Cassie does in Euphoria, because I remember there was this one shot of Cassie in Euphoria that I watched on WeChat channels when I scrolled through the videos, and it was Cassie portrayed as a giant in the buildings of Hollywood, and she was like navigating through those places, and it just showed that Cassie really desires a life of her own, and also like getting all the attention and validation from other people as well. And so I think this is very similar, not only because it's basically the same dream, but also I think it shows how like insecure those women are, because I mean, all the respect and love for actresses and actors in Hollywood, but I think this job really requires people to live up to the majority of the validation from the public, if that makes sense, because their career relies on people validating them and people loving what they do and also them as a person. And so this kind of reflects their inner insecurity on who they are and how much they crave attention because they feel empty inside and they don't feel satisfied of what they have around them. And they also both rely on other people to achieve this dream. So, in Of Mice and Men, Laura talks about how she talked to this guy when she was in this event in Los Angeles, I believe. And she was like, "Oh, I met this man and he promised me that he will write to me if he has the chance of getting me into the Hollywood business." But I never got a letter from him. And I think my old lady hid the letters. And in Euphoria for Cassie, she married Nate, and for the same reason of achieving that dream through someone else. And coincidentally, they're both men, and both women are betting all of their chances on the support of that man, which is eventually an empty promise. And this gap between their expectation and the reality just reinforces how insecure they are of their own and how insecure they are not only of themselves like as a person but also like their capabilities, because they don't think that they could achieve that themselves. And so Cassie also later relies on Maddie for helping her. And I'm not saying that success is always a one person task. Success is definitely something that requires a whole team or multiple people, but here in Euphoria and Of Mice and Men, those two women reflect how much insecurity leads to this big gap of expectation and reality. And I think this teaches us that we need to love ourselves more and trust ourselves more. So, this is the similarity between Cassie and Laura's relationship in the two works. So, our third point is a little bit implicit, but I do think that this is kind of valid, which is Laura not allowed to talk to other men on the ranch versus Alamo's human trafficking. So, in Of Mice and Men, Laura is not allowed to talk to other men on the ranch because there are no other women on the ranch. And Curly explicitly stated that, like, I don't like my girl talking to other men on the ranch. It gets me uncomfortable. And so This is kind of similar to Euphoria's character Alamo. So Alamo is a human trafficker, and I watched this documentary on YouTube about how those girls are treated when they are being sex trafficked. And like when I heard those stories, I feel like this is pretty similar to how Laura is treated because those pimps, they don't allow the girls to achieve autonomy and to also seek opportunities for themselves and to just essentially have freedom. And so I feel like this is very similar because it shows how much desire for control Alamo and Curly has over their girls. And this is also very sad to hear because this also shows that the insecurity that the women have in those two works, it's not just from within them. It's also the majority of that insecurity comes from their experiences and how the people around them treat them. And so that shows how much the women's future depends on other people too, which is tied to our point on the Hollywood dream earlier. And so our next point is Maddie being the role of George to Cassie. So in Of Mice and Men, Lenny and George travel together. And so George is kind of this parent to Lenny. And so Lenny and George, they are the pair of protagonists of Mice and Men. Like the novel is written from their perspective. And so George is kind of this person who guides Lenny throughout uh, being on the ranch and finding a new job and trying to make Lenny make the right decisions because, of course, Lenny can't think as an adult. He has a mind of a 5-year-old. So, George kind of plans out where they will go, how they will get there, and is this parent to Lenny, which is kind of similar to how Maddie is the manager to Cassie in Of Mice and Men. And Maddie plans what Cassie's going to do, how she's going to do it, and what their future is going to be like. And although, of course, Cassie is resistant sometimes, and so is Lenny, this shows how those two pairs, they are kind of relying on each other for this very small hope for survival because in both of their circumstances, their chances of achieving success and achieving ultimately the American dream is by always chasing this thing that is impossible. Because, for example, in the Great Depression, which is the setting of Mice and Men, buying a home and owning land, that is the ultimate dream. But for migrant workers like George and Lenny, it won't be as accessible because they are essentially at the bottom of society. And Maddie and Cassie, they have this dream of being stars and being celebrities, but they are also arguably at the very bottom of society because they don't have a stable job. They're relying on this very unstable platform of income. And so this is not the only thing that makes them similar. One other thing that makes Cassie and Maddie and George and Lenny similar is how repeatedly Cassie and Lenny makes mistakes. So in Of Mice and Men, Lenny always breaks mice and puppies when petting them because he likes to pet soft things like a child, but he always breaks them because he's too strong by holding them. And this is similar how Cassie always doesn't achieve what Maddie wants her to achieve and always gets in trouble and doesn't perform as well as expected. And so I think this reflects how much of their success depend on this one shot at a certain thing that is probably impossible to achieve. And this repeated cycle of success just reinforces how, in their circumstances, the achievement of success is impossible. Hello, this is Margaret editing. I realized that I just missed an entire section of George and Lenny and Maddie and Cassie's relationship being the same when their American dream dies at the end of both stories, but you can read that on my blog and probably some other things that I missed as well on my blog, so definitely check that out, and I'm sorry for the parts that I missed. And now I have 2 points that are direct character comparisons. So, first of all, it's Nate and Curly's violence. And so it is shown through their desired control of their partners. So, in Euphoria, in season one, I believe, we see that Nate is trying to control Maddie, trying to threaten her by choking her. And all he wanted to do is to try to warn her to not show her personality again because it threatens their relationship. And so Curly will also use violent measures to try to control Laura to not talk to other men on the ranch. So both of those two men, they use their violence and very direct methods to warn their partners to not be themselves when they're not threatening their relationship at all, in my opinion, because Maddie was just exuding who she is. And Laura is also exuding who she is because they're both feeling lonely and they're insecure in their relationship. And so Nate and Curly using those very violent methods, it just shows what toxic masculinity is. And it shows just how much control and power they desire in a relationship to the point where it suffocates someone. And our next character comparison is Lexi and Slim. So Lexi is kind of a background character in Euphoria, but her presence is very similar to Slim in Of Mice and Men. And so um, Slim in Of Mice and Men, he is a godlike character, quote, Prince of the Ranch. So he doesn't really have to show anything to prove his existence on the ranch. He doesn't have to use violence to show his control or to always try to prove that he has authority. And this is kind of like Lexi because they're both like quiet observers of the situation and they both really have like their own internal thoughts on certain things, but they don't necessarily have to share it with other people or always being loud and dramatic. And their presence show kind of like the goal of what all the characters in those works are trying to achieve. They reflect the ultimate kind of person that has a stable job, I guess, and they both have really stable internal beings, and they are both very secure in themselves. And so I think those 3 points really just encapsulate what the people on the ranch and in Euphoria just want to become, just having a stable life and a stable source of income, stable relationships, stable everything. And I think that is kind of like the goal of what all the characters are trying to achieve here, but unfortunately, that is not what happens. But they do represent that, and I think that shows the goal of everyone here. And that is all I have to say about Euphoria and Of Mice and Men. And disclaimer, in no way am I saying Euphoria is copying Of Mice and Men because those two works, they reflect very similar themes because those issues still are in American society. And I think especially the fact that Cassie is trying to seek validation online for her body is similar to how Laura is doing so on the ranch as well when she throws her body forward in front of the men. It shows how this insecurity it leads to um, women trying to exaggerate their appearances for validation. This still is a very big issue anytime in human history. And so those two works, they reflect similar values, similar themes to show how much work there has to be done in society to achieve true justice. And I hope that people can see the show and the book in a similar lens, I hope, and they're both iconic, they're both legendary, and so yeah, that is it for today, for our teenage thoughts today, and I will see you guys next week. Bye.